A real crime. In a series of podcasts, I want you to travel down some lonely roads with me. These are the roads I traveled with families who never got to say goodbye to loved ones. These family members were fated to live the rest of their lives waiting and wondering. I will begin this series with unsolved murders, but I will also revisit cases that include arrests because aspects of the case are worth re-examining. I wrote these stories when I worked as a reporter for the Charleston Gazette. With gratitude, I welcome you. Today is my first time to talk about technology in crime solving. With advances in technology, so many crimes could be solved. Episode 20, She Persisted. A persistent family member, advanced technology, and a trooper confined to desk duty combined to solve a murder I want to talk about today. I have met many persistent family members before. They keep asking questions. They keep talking to police. My heart goes out to them. Some crimes would not be solved without them, but few are as successful as Angie Upton after she set out to find out what happened to her niece. Angie's case is still tragic because her niece was found murdered, but at least she did not have to become a member of that group no one wants to belong to, the families who never get answers. Unsolved cases also need a dedicated officer or officers. Sergeant Robert Stump took his own injury and turned it into an asset. A foot injury confined him to desk duty. That gave him the time he needed to solve this case. Then, both family and police were lucky, and advance in technology brought them the resolution they wanted so badly. In April 2002, Bonnie Luann Woods Cale drove to Tucker County to visit her then 4-year-old daughter, who was living with her former husband. From there, she planned to drive on to Cleveland, Ohio, to see her parents. We now know she never made it out of Tucker County. Her Aunt Angie, who lives in Kanawha County, started calling her niece immediately after she did not show up at her parents' home in Ohio. She knew Bonnie would have called in. Bonnie loved to use her cell phone and had been known to make as many as 60 calls a day. When Bonnie did not answer her phone, Angie feared the worst. Angie started putting up posters and making calls. As time passed, Angie knew she had to turn to the police. When she planned her trip, Bonnie was in the process of establishing her residency in Kanawha County. She lived in Cedar Grove. After her aunt asked police to look for her, searchers found her Chevrolet Blazer in Webster County. Inside the vehicle, they found a pair of jeans and a coffee cup that belonged to Bonnie. Knowing that Bonnie planned to drive to Tucker County, that meant authorities had 3 jurisdictions to deal with. From the beginning, that made matters difficult. Over the course of the investigation, police searched in 6 different places. One officer also pointed out that 3 counties constitute a large geographic area. The Tucker County Sheriff's Department started the investigation, but they needed help from state troopers who could work across county lines. A trooper in the Parsons office, Sergeant Stump, had worked on the case for years. Then he suffered an accident that injured his foot. He could not go out as he would normally, but he was allowed to work at his desk. He explained the case generated many file boxes, but it's hard to get time to spend on just one thing, he said, with many demands on an officer's time. Suddenly, he had the concentrated time he needed. Bonnie's former husband was always a suspect. With a warrant, police searched his property unsuccessfully. At about the same time that Sergeant Stump had extra time to concentrate on the case, improvements to ground-penetrating radar became available. This non-destructive method uses radar pulses to create images of the subsurface. This technology clearly offered answers for Stump, but he did not know how to use it. He was aided by a West Virginia University professor who specializes in the devices. The professor joined members of the West Virginia Search and Rescue Team and Stump in Tucker County. They found the victim's body buried underground inside a shed. By hand, someone drew 7 hearts on the inside of the shed where Bonnie was buried. An arrow from one heart pointed to the grave. Bonnie had been missing for 7 years. After the bones were found, they still needed to be identified. The state medical examiner contacted Dr. Douglas W. Owsley at the Smithsonian Institute. He is a world-renowned expert in his field. Owsley found severe trauma to the bones. His testimony led to a murder indictment for Bonnie's former husband, Wesley Scott Cale Sr. He was 42 at the time he was charged. Bonnie was 27 when she disappeared. When Bonnie first separated from her husband, her daughter lived with her. Custody arrangements were not formalized at that time. On a visit to see his daughter, Cale told Bonnie he was taking their daughter shopping, but he actually took her to his home in Tucker County and kept her. In an earlier interview, Angie told me how much she appreciated Stump's dedication. He promised he would not retire until the case was solved. After her niece was found, Angie said her children needed information so that they could move on with their lives. I appreciate the hard work and dedication of Sergeant Stump. Bonnie had another child from a previous marriage. Ultimately, Cale entered a plea to second-degree murder. Cale never admitted his guilt, but he agreed to the plea. He has since been released from prison after serving his sentence. Stump said he pushed for first-degree murder, but he wanted to spare the children who would have had to testify. They had been through enough, he said. Angie always suspected her niece was a battered woman, but Bonnie never turned to the court system. That meant there was no paper trail for officers to start with. Angie worried and grieved before her niece was found. She frequently telephoned Sergeant Stump during the years her niece was missing to stay updated on his progress. Stump said from the beginning he knew the case was solvable. He said he's pleased that all the elements came together to close the case. He also said he was glad he had help from Angie, a persistent family member. As always, thanks for listening, and thanks to Tommy Siner for his great work. Please join me next Wednesday for another episode of A Real Crime with Susan Williams.